right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Katie Glynn. I am one of the moderators for today's session. I work in the Yale School of Development, not School of Development anymore, School of Management, in the Dean's office. And I've been at Yale for about 11 years. And I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Ashley.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Cumberledge. I also work at the School of Management. I have been at Yale for about 6 years, and I am the assistant director for the Yale program on financial stability and the master's in systemic risk program.
Yeah, we are so happy that all you guys are here today, and we have a great panel for you. Just to introduce everything, we are the Fly Lean In Mentorship program, and this is our session on crafting your communication style. For those of you who are not familiar, and for those of you who are, the Fly Lean In Mentorship program offers a series of 4 to 5 panel discussions throughout the academic year. We're focused on career development topics that are pertinent to the Fly contingency. This is, I believe, the 3rd one for this academic year, and we are so excited you guys are all here. And today, again, we will be talking about communication styles, which I think has become rather prevalent during this pandemic when so many of us are working remotely or in hybrid formats. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought on a new set of communication challenges that can be difficult to navigate. So we have 4 great panelists to speak to you today. They represent different departments within the university, and they will provide their take on topics such as communicating with compassion during difficult times, how to avoid groupthink in meetings, and leading effectively over Zoom, as well as other topics. We will allow for Q&A towards the end, so certainly feel free to type in any questions you have into the Q&A tool. And actually, before we begin, we have a question for you guys, the audience. We'll be doing a few polls throughout this session, and we want to begin with a little bit of a fun one. I know that so many of us have been working from home for the past year or so and aren't going to New Haven as often as usual. So we're wondering if you guys are missing any particular New Haven cuisine. So let's start that poll, and certainly please answer. A lot of people are missing food carts. I am myself. All right, looks like we have everyone answered. All right, so food carts are the winner, followed by pizza, of course, coffee, sushi, and then Thai. I have to say I'm biased. I love all those types of cuisine, but I certainly miss food carts. That's a big part of the New Haven experience, I think. All right, without further ado, we will introduce our panelists. Patrick, let's start with you.
Awesome. My name is Patrick O'Brien Stavilla. My pronouns are he, him. I've worked at Yale for nearly 8 years, the last 5 as the communications officer for the Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning. And just to tie into that food question, I grew up in East Haven, so I've always loved New Haven restaurants. And my favorite place is Cafe Bravo, which is a small family-owned Italian cafe in East Rock neighborhood. If you're really looking for like a cozy spot or a great spot to go with your significant other, it's a really nice place and very casual atmosphere.
Excellent choice. Jourdan, how about yourself?
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Ashley, for inviting me to sit on this panel. My name is Jourdan Brooks. I'm the Associate Director for Community and Inclusion at Yale School of Management and use the pronouns he, him. Been at Yale for coming up on 3 years now, and in April, actually. And my favorite food in New Haven is the tie between the two, either Sandra's Next Generation or Mama Mary's. They're both 2 Black-owned soul food restaurants in New Haven. So those are the foods that I eat most often. And that's, if I had to recommend a place, it'll be those 2.
Awesome. How about you, Amy?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to be among such great fellow Yale colleagues. So I work at the Yale School of Management. I'm the Director of Digital. I'm also a 2nd-year executive MBA student in the sustainability track at Yale SOM. And yeah, I oversee all of our own communication channels, so social media, websites, I also produce our Yale Career Conversations podcast. And as for food, you know, it's really saying one is really hard. I really miss Otaru sushi. I miss the 116 crown cocktail list. I miss a Blue State cappuccino and like all things pizza. So I really do miss modern pizza as well.
And last but not least, Mela.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mela Waters. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. It's great to reconnect with some of you and meet new colleagues. I am a training manager and coach at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, where we bring social and emotional learning to K through 12 educators. I've been at Yale for about 9 years. I was in ITS previously, and one place that I love in New Haven, and I've been to during the pandemic as well, who have a food truck and a restaurant, is Vegan Ahava. They are delicious, so highly recommend them. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Ashley, would you like to take it away?
Sure, yes. Thank you. I'll echo what Katie said, and thank you all for being here. We'll start with one more poll question before we go into our first set of questions. So going to launch that now for you. Do you feel that Zoom meetings with your colleagues are more or less productive than in-person meetings? Okay, so it looks like the highest answer is that you don't feel much of a difference, which is very interesting because it could definitely go either way. And I'm very curious to get into this next topic, because what we're going to talk about is groupthink and how to avoid that in meetings. And I'm wondering if this might be kind of, you know, an issue in meetings that people are feeling virtually or in person. So Amy, I wanted to get your view on this, because both in-person and Zoom meetings can really easily get taken over by groupthink. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is for people who may not be aware of it, and provide a few examples of how it can negatively affect a meeting?
Sure. So I think a lot of us can probably guess what it is, even if we don't know what it is. And I should probably preface by saying I'm not a social psychologist. However, you know, I'm pretty familiar with this topic. It comes up a lot in our MBA curriculum, and I've seen it happen quite a bit. So, and there's a quote that I wanted to share from a reading that I'd be happy to share with you all. It's in a large organization, good ideas have lots of foster parents, and the bad decisions produce lots of orphans. Consensus is safer. We know that, right? So we know consensus is safer. Groupthink causes us to choose consensus over sometimes what could be sound strategic decision-making. At times it could be innocuous. It's not a big deal to just kind of go along with the group. But other times it could be disastrous. And in fact, for those who aren't familiar with the Bay of Pigs, you know, President Kennedy really wanted to overthrow Castro, and Kennedy's direct involvement with his team on it actually caused the whole group to kind of go forward and not really give it a good, sound, strategic thought process. So we all know now disaster then ensued. So, you know, we want to encourage critical thought whenever we're in a meeting, you know, respectful, critical thought, even though we're consensus-driven beings and groups. And so how do you cultivate a culture where you want to welcome more kind of constructive feedback? There's a few ways to do that. Just one, be aware of it. You know, I think one very specific way I've seen it done, and I try to do it when I see groupthink overtake a conversation or a group or a team or a project, is to either designate a person who can advocate for a devil's advocate position, or, you know, you yourself can bring it up and just say, you know, I see your point. I see where this is going. Just want to offer a devil's advocate position because I notice that there's not any other dissenting or critical points of view. So I think it's kind of important to do that when you see a conversation or a project sort of being overtaken by this, you know, this consensus-driven, you know, inertia. I think it's really important to do that.
Definitely. And moving on to the psychological side of it, Mela, what are some of the psychological factors in, in why this happens and why people feel that they just have to kind of go along with what the group is saying?
Thank you, Ashley. And so I was doing some research on this and found that actually like groupthink was first studied and an article was published by a Yale research psychologist, Irving Janis. And he was studying groupthink with the military and looking at their decisions and how they came to that conclusion. And then, we have a lot more research going to this, but it seemed like the factors, the main one, as you can imagine, is the lack of conflict and viewpoints, right? When you don't feel like there is a safe place to have to express a viewpoint that is different from the group. And some of the factors that go into it is, if you have a strong, very persuasive group leader, when you have, the group has a high level of cohesion, right? Harmony is valued over conflict, just, people not being comfortable with conflict and difficult conversations. And then you have pressures. So you can have pressures that are from outside forces or time pressures, right? When you don't have a lot of time to brainstorm and think all the possibilities, but it tends to look at moving forward too quickly with a decision without considering all the alternatives, and then not knowing if this is the right decision or not. And sometimes you get into an illusion loop where you think this is the best, but you're not. You don't know what you don't know, and you didn't have a chance to explore it. And a lot of things like, censorship and, stereotyping, when people, the stakes are really high, so you feel a lot of pressure. And it's hard. It is hard to speak up your mind. Power dynamics can play a really important role in this. The culture, the climate that is at stake. And there's different things that we can do in-person meetings and Zoom meetings, like Amy was saying, to start to notice the signs and to look at where are we in this? Did we brainstorm enough? Are we moving too quickly? And what is everyone's facial expressions? How are they doing? Something we have done in our team, proposed by a colleague, is kind of voting with your fingers. It's like, you absolutely agree, right? 4, 3, 2, like a quick way to see how strongly people feel about something and how not, because sometimes people do not say that in words, or giving the opportunity for people to write their opinion in chat, right? Like thinking of the different personalities that you have in your team. And a danger is when you're trying to fit in too much as well. So you want to respect, listen, and be inclusive in decision making as much as you can and as appropriate for everyone in the team to speak up.
Thank you. And then Patrick, what best practices have you found in conducting meetings to make sure that everyone's perspective is heard and welcomed?
Thank you, Ashley, for the question. And thank you, Mel and Amy, for kind of explaining the concept of groupthink. And I agree, if you are a meeting organizer, you do feel a lot of pressure, as Mela said, and to Amy's point, you really want to make sure that you have dissenting opinions and different perspectives in your meeting. So there are a couple of tools that I found really useful. I think the most powerful tool is actually your meeting agenda. And so if you're an organizer, to really try and prepare that and share it in advance of your meeting, it helps to set expectations. It helps with an opportunity to gather feedback before the meeting. And you have a tool to use during the meeting to organize communication and kind of organize the different perspectives you have in the room. And so, one of the best ways to do that is to kind of spend some time creating your agenda. Additionally, as you request or prompt input from everyone, I think it's really helpful to clarify how you want people to interact and participate, especially in this era of Zoom where you might not have the ability to see all participants on the screen, and there might be a chat and a live conversation taking place at the same time, and certain people might dominate the conversation. So really kind of setting the room and setting the expectations of how you want people to participate is really important. So you might want to ask people to raise their hands either digitally or in person. Respectfully ask people to refrain from interrupting contributions that are happening in the room, and to allow others to share is a great way to kind of signal your desire for equitable participation and kind of build that equity in the room. And then I think it's super important to also avoid cold calling on individuals, because you never know what's happening in someone's life that day and their comfort level regarding a particular topic. And so if you do plan on kind of running a meeting where it's important to cold call on people, definitely provide that warning in advance. And sharing your agenda also helps prepare people for your meeting and allow them to gather their thoughts and come prepared. So it eliminates that element of surprise. It also allows people to have thoughts before they enter the room, and so they get a little less carried away into other people's thoughts if they have come in with some information behind that.
Thank you. Those are all really great suggestions, because I think that a lot of us kind of get into just the same, daily routines of our meetings, our interactions with our coworkers. So we might show up to a meeting and, like you said, be cold called. And since we weren't expecting that and having an off day, and that's not usually how our meetings go, it can really, really throw people off. So thank you for that. And then Jourdan, touching base on this same topic from a diversity standpoint, explain to us, is it more difficult for someone from a different background, whether it be a racial background, cultural, religious, educational? Is it harder for these individuals to speak their mind in meetings if they disagree with the group?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's naturally going to be more difficult for anyone to speak their mind if they're a minority on a team, whether it's being the only Black, the only female, the only person, Latinx person, the only gay person. I think all of those things play a part into how the team ends up communicating with one another, especially considering how much of the identity a person's able to bring to the workplace with them or to that team. So you sort of think like, is this happening because I am X identity or I come from X background? You start to play run those questions through your mind. And you have to take into account the social capital that the individual may have or how much they may not have on that team. So what does disagreeing then look like? What are the implications that may come from disagreeing because of this, also because of this identity that I carry? So those are a few things that come to mind when I think about, identity plus disagreeing. Like it's kind of a double whammy, if you will. And you have to consider those things when you do hold an identity that may not be of the majority. We talked about power dynamics a little bit, and you have to also consider that of who you're disagreeing with, and then how that is then going to impact them depending on their identity too. And unfortunately for some, you have to have that in the back of your mind, like, how am I also going to be perceived? Are my words going to be heard, or am I going to be seen first, then my words are going to be heard? And that's something that many people have to then deal with and struggle with disagreeing. But to many of the points that were already made, disagreeing should be welcomed and encouraged or even expected. One, just to make sure we realize what is missing from ideas or strategies, because there may be things that are missing, and that disagreement may be what gets us over the hump, or just may qualify what we're actually talking about. So I think that's important to truly consider as well. But then also making sure that the perspectives of all people are actually heard, including the stakeholders or the people who are going to be impacted by whatever the decision is, and then maybe even future considerations. So I think when it comes to disagreeing in general, it's of course a healthy practice to definitely have, but having that additional factor when it comes to identity is definitely going to play a factor into it. And you kind of have to think of the power dynamics within the group, who you're disagreeing with. Am I able to be my full self, or not even full self, or am I able to share and hold my identity within this team? Am I comfortable with that? And even considering all of those things, if those things are present, you have to think about too, it's important to note that these problems didn't come from a virtual space. Like these problems were present when we were in person, and that's a much larger issue that will then have to be tackled. But you know, being in a virtual space now is kind of multiplying those options for people, as far as, you know, having to consider who they are and how they show up and how much social capital they may not have. So disagreeing may not go over well for them, but I think it's an important and healthy practice for teams to definitely take advantage of.
Definitely, thank you. We did have a question come through. Sorry, Amy, were you gonna piggyback off of that?
I would love to add just a really quick point to Jourdan's comment, which is, you know, if you are a manager or you're leading a team or a project, to be very cognizant of what Jourdan was just pointing out, but just be aware that there's also a cognitive bias called anchoring. I won't go into detail about it, but it basically means that, you know, we weight the first information we hear more strongly than subsequent information. So if you're a manager, you're convening a team or a project, just be aware of that. So be aware of what you're saying and how you're saying it. If you really do want to invite all perspectives, you might want to hold back a little bit up front, right? You might want to not just kind of show all your cards, as it were, to make sure that all those voices are heard. So I just wanted to toss that out there.
Thank you. Thank you. Jourdan, someone asked a question, how do you define social capital? And is that the same as being able to persuade the group's perspective?
Yeah, I think social capital has everything to do with an influence that a person may have over a team or an idea. So you look at that, and I think you can kind of naturally see within a team who has more influence than others. And often, you know, when ideas are brought up, whose ideas are being shot down, whose ideas are also being muted, or whose ideas are being heard but said by someone else and being amplified by that other person. So social capital kind of plays into all of those different aspects. But I guess you can kind of boil it down to influence overall.
Thank you. Katie, do you want to take over with the next poll question?
Sure thing. All right, so our next poll is going to ask, the pandemic has added an extra stress layer to everyday life. Have you witnessed or experienced more stress reactions during your workday due to the difficulties that the pandemic has brought on? Let me launch that now. Hold on, I'm having a little poll difficulty. Laura, can you assist? Thank you. All right, lots of stress so far, understandably. All right, we have 82% have replied so far, and with an astounding yes, definitely. There has been added stress and more stress reactions during the workday. So thank you all for answering that. And with that not surprising answer, let's focus a little bit on stress in our next round of questions. So Mela, I'd like to begin with you, given your experience with emotional intelligence and your background. What advice do you have for those of us who have experienced an increased amount of stress when it comes to our work life? And how do we deal with our immediate reactions better?
Thank you, Katie. And I do want to say up front that, you know, I am a learner and I'm here to learn with all of you. You know, expertise in this it's all about the practice that we have. But this takes me back to a quote that we often use to answer such a question. It's from Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So you're asking about like, what can we do, like, right, to not be so reactive or to be a little bit more thoughtful when you are triggered, especially when you are under a high amount of stress over and over and over again. We know that stress is good, is motivational, but chronic stress, right? As we know, the pandemic, it's over a year now, and how do we respond from that? So one of the tools we use at the center is called the Meta moment, and it has 4 steps. The first step is about, you are noticing that you just got triggered, right? Like something happened, something was said, right? You were in a Zoom meeting and someone just called your name, like Patrick said you shouldn't do when you're not expecting it. Or you are predicting a very difficult conversation on your performance review with your manager, whichever it is, like you notice that trigger and you identify that, something has happened, that it's kind of shaking you up. The second step in that tool is to just take a moment, take a breath. So we know that when you freeze, right, when the impact is flight, fright, or freeze, you want to take a breath, because breathing will just help bring oxygen to your brain and have you be a little, be able to think. Because sometimes when you get triggered like that, you're just not able to think. So taking the moment, like Viktor Frankl said in his quote, to pause, to not respond right away. And then step 3, thinking about, well, what are my strategies here? What is my best self in this moment? Right? Like I am a colleague right now, or I'm a manager right now. How do I want to show up? And then looking, the last step, looking at your strategies and utilizing your strategies to act, so that you have a goal, you know who you want to be, and you have that. But we know that, moments are like this, and sometimes, right, you want to react. So other strategies that I recommend, I just listened to a great podcast on burnout, actually, and they had some, great strategies. There's a new book out there on burnout. Talked about just cultivating well-being, in your life, in your everyday life, and that will help with being able to practice that pause and that breath before reacting. So doing things like movement, right? Whatever that is for you, taking a walk, dancing, exercise, physical activity will allow you to have more space, better sleep, of course, breathing, practicing breathing, positive social interactions is definitely, great. Being able to be part of a safe space community where you can have brave conversations, and things like laughter, and with the people that you are in a bubble with, be able to hug and have that physical contact and affection is important. And finding a way to have to express yourself creatively. Like the more of these things that are in your everyday life, it will help you be better at that response when the stress is high, the pressure is high, and you want to have less regrets and be able to practice how you want to show up.
That's a really, really great advice. I think I need a sticky note that says breathe right by my computer. Patrick, can you tell us, or what can you tell us about tone when composing communications during times like this? Even in normal times, tone can be a tricky thing to process via email. What general tips can you provide?
Thank you, Katie, for that question. And Mela, I love that the space to choose. I think that's something that I'm going to keep in mind. I, like Mela, will want to first say that even as a communicator for my day-to-day job, I don't get it right 100% of the time. And I want to acknowledge that we've all had to adjust to new and different mediums of communication in the last year, because we've stripped away face-to-face communications in rooms where you have the ability to read different social cues and hear inflection in people's voices. So written communication is very hard. And the most important thing to keep in mind is how different it is than speaking something to someone in a face-to-face context. So I think that's just kind of the number one thing to keep in mind first when you're thinking about tone and when you're thinking about writing something to another person. I have found that it's extremely important and helpful to read your emails or your letters out loud, which sounds very basic, but it has helped me in so many circumstances. I don't think I've ever hit send on a mass email to any part of the Yale community without reading it out loud to myself. And certainly my husband, who's working from home as well, gets to hear all of those messages, which is another layer to this whole situation that we're all in. But I would also say that it is important to read messages with the benefit of the doubt first, because often I find that coworkers are really trying to help each other, especially in positive working environments. And so we all know that we might not get the tone right, but it's important to kind of provide a little bit of a moment for kind of giving the benefit of the doubt to the person who sent you that message, because you're likely all on the same team, you're working in the same department, you're all trying to work toward the same mission. And so if you read it and it still doesn't seem right, try to avoid your gut reaction of responding defensively, which speaks to Mela's point about choosing that space to kind of have a moment and breathe and think through your response, because it's probably the hardest thing to do and to really get into the mindset of doing routinely. But it's definitely something that will help you as a communicator, so that your response is measured and appropriate and you don't escalate the situation, which is very quick to happen with email communication, because you're responding, you receive a response, and your immediate reaction is to respond again. And that is certainly something that's been exacerbated during the pandemic, where you feel like you need to respond very quickly to folks because we're in this digital environment, and you have different cues like the little green dot in Zoom chats where it lets people know that you're available, or you're logged onto your email and maybe you have read receipts and that sort of thing. So take a moment to yourself, like Mela said, and really think about your tone before you respond, and try not to escalate a situation if you think that the person who you're communicating with doesn't fully understand your original message. And this is certainly hard to do. It has happened to me. It happened earlier this month, and I felt so guilty and bad about kind of my response to a message that I had received that felt very defensive, and my reaction was to respond in a defensive tone. And luckily, we both kind of caught that, and only had one back and forth before we decided, wait a minute, we need to take this offline, pick up the phone, call each other, and talk this through, because we are not on the same page. My original message was supposed to be helpful. This original message is not matching that tone. And so how do we align ourselves? So sometimes it's to kind of go back to methods where you're not on email or not using written communication to readjust and reset your communication.
Thank you for that great response, and thank you for your honesty. Yeah, I always appreciate when people share their own blunders, because I tend to dwell on my own. So thank you for sharing that. And I think it's really helpful to remember that even though we're in this very email heavy world right now, that we can always, go back to other modes of communication to really settle things. So thank you for that. Jourdan, I want to ask, how do you think about tone when communicating topics that can bring up a lot of emotion, such as Black Lives Matter or the recent hate crimes against Asian Americans?
Yeah, so when I read this question initially, like the two words that stood out to me, of course, were tone and emotion. I mean, it's important no matter what, when communicating in any regard, it's important to be clear, it's important to be direct, and it's also important to be consistent. But tone in itself can be extremely dicey and subjective. Culturally, tone can represent different things, have different representations depending on the culture. There can be some cultures who communicate a little bit louder with more hand gestures and things be perfectly fine, while others in other cultures can be more reserved when they're communicating. So the idea of tone in itself has so many implications. But it's important, however, to realize a person's tone is a reflection of their emotion. And I don't think that is to be policed by anyone. So it's extremely important to recognize when I'm talking or someone is talking about an emotional topic, they are giving you who they are in that moment. And I don't think it's for anyone to police or have a reaction when it's someone giving their natural response or reaction to something. But it's also obviously important to recognize like who the audience is. So is this a space where, you know, tone, if it needs to be aggressive, how is that going to be received? And is that the point? Because when you talk about emotions, everyone's going to react relatively differently. And I don't think that's something that, you know, we should have to worry too much about, because we own our own emotions. And I think when it comes to tone, especially when talking about, you know, matters like Black Lives Matter or the anti-Asian actions that have been happening, you know, it's supposed to be emotional. And I don't think when communications are going out, it's meant to just be an information source. I think the point was to inflict emotion and also share and sit in that space of emotion, because people are going through things. But I think it's also, you know, you have to recognize that some people may feel like those things are, you know, lack professionalism, but then you kind of go down another kind of dicey road when it comes to what professionalism actually is. And then think about who the gatekeepers of what professionalism is. And typically that perspective has been from a singular view, and it isn't representative of all people. So when reacting to topics overall, you know, that may bring up emotion, I think it's definitely important to understand that we're not all the same. We're not always going to all react the same. And a person's tone is just as valid as someone else's. So if there is a ton of emotion within it, it's okay. Just as if there's someone else with a different tone that may not have as much emotion. But if you're upset, I think it's important to show that. If as a community is upset about something that has happened, I think it's definitely important to make sure that tone is actually shared in a manner in which that, of course, gets your point across. But I think it's important to be genuine about how you're responding or reacting to certain things. You know, one thing that'll definitely always be true is that we all won't react the same, and our tone won't always be the same, and we may not always agree with others' tone. But I think it's important to make sure we separate the person from the actual message, because someone may be reacting to something and that's just how their natural reaction is, and the message can't actually be lost. But it'll be definitely important for us to make sure we take it in the tone too, because that'll just explain further what their emotions are. And like I said before, I don't think emotions should be policed by no means, or tone shouldn't be policed. So when it comes to tone and communicating messages, like I said, it's important to be clear, it's important to be direct, and it's important to allow people to feel, regardless of what that tone ends up looking like. At that point, I don't think it's a matter of brand or anything like that. People are responding real, and I think we should allow for people to be human and feel, and whatever that tone ends up being, I think that ends up being okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that really beautiful response. Amy, I'm wondering, for those working in digital media like yourself, or those who may be managing social media accounts, do you have suggestions for creating impactful and creative or compassionate messaging?
You know, there's no shortcut, right? I think that the one thing I'll say is, you know, you have to do the work. You have a lot of work ahead of you. You have to understand your organization's positioning and values. And as Jourdan was just describing, tone, right? You need to have that nailed down. You need to really understand that from an organizational perspective, so that everything you're doing is aligned and going through those lenses. And at a certain point, it almost becomes, you know, it becomes really routine, because you know what those are, you know what those strategic messaging points are, you know what your priorities are. You don't have to do a lot of, you know, fishing for that. So you have to do the homework and you have to understand those. And I think it's also, you know, it takes a team, right? So we have a great team at SOM that manages our social. My colleague Lori does such an amazing job. And, we're not afraid to make mistakes. We're not afraid to look at our data, analyze our audiences, test things and course correct. So I would think, it definitely takes a little bit of an entrepreneurial and mindset in that, you're always sort of testing and trying to realign with your audiences. So always be course correcting, analyze your performance, know your audience, and just do your homework. That would be my quick roadmap.
That's great advice. Thank you. And I like your willingness to make mistakes and to course correct. I think that's a really strong point. We did have a question come in through the Q&A that I want to address just because it's really relevant to what we're talking about here right now. So someone said, I found that the pandemic has exposed the tone deafness of emails to the point where I had another professor read the emails I received from my advisor, and even they flinched. This led to situations getting escalated very quickly without addressing the root cause. Like the informal advisor-trainee relationships have gotten rarer because of social distancing, so the weight given to these emails increases. Suggestions or advice for moving forward are most appreciated. Does anyone have any initial responses to that?
I think, Katie, I would go back to kind of, hopefully one of the things that I tried to share was when you are realizing that you're both coming at it from a very different perspective, sometimes written communication is just too hard to rely on. And so I might suggest either trying to set up virtual office hours or a phone call check-in, because then you're both kind of talking in the moment, and you can start to hear inflection, and you can start to understand where that person is coming from. I don't know that that gets to the root cause, and so it worries me because I don't know what the root cause is in this situation. And so, depending on what it is, you might actually need to escalate that to someone and talk about it at a higher level. I was thinking, especially, if you're feeling like this is a situation where the person's kind of beliefs are rooted in a very negative place, you might want to think about, how do I talk with the chair of that department or things like that to kind of understand what your options are for your advisor and different things like that. But without knowing a little more, I'm hesitant to kind of provide more advice on that.
Yeah, I would just quickly suggest there's a mental model called Hanlon's razor, which goes something like never attribute to malice that which can be ascribed to neglect or something like that. So basically assume best intentions. I realize that's sort of after the fact, but I find that that's a really helpful frame in these situations where it's a very, we're all kind of on the verge of burnout, and we would all benefit from extending ourselves as well as each other a little bit more grace. So assuming best intentions is always a great place to start, even if you feel triggered.
That's a great response. Thank you. All right, Ashley, would you like to handle the next round of questions?
Sure. So before we move on to the next section, we are going to open up another poll question. And let's go ahead and launch that. So these days, there are many modes of communication in the workplace. Which one do you feel is most effective for collaboration? Email, Slack, Microsoft Teams, or Zoom? Seems like Zoom is taking a leading spot, followed by Microsoft Teams, which I have not even used yet. So that's very interesting. And then email and Slack. So it looks like 88% of people have voted. So we're going to end the polling and share the results here. And you can see Zoom is the highest with 58%, followed by Microsoft Teams, email, and Slack. All right, and then Katie, if you want to take away with the next question.
Sure thing. So this question is going to be directed to all of you. With so many different ways of communicating, as we just saw in our poll, how can we ensure that our online meetings and communications are accessible and how can we transition that accessibility into our in-person environment? And as we discussed before, this can be accessible in either the social or technical, accessible in the social or technical sense. Thank you. Let's start with Mela.
Sorry, Katie, I was a little distracted reading some of the questions that were coming in, but you're asking about accessibility? Okay.
Correct, accessibility in our current environment, and how can we transition those tools of accessibility into our in-person environment?
Yeah, I don't, I think continuing to evolve, like doing things like surveys. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer these questions, honestly.
No
But
problem.
I did want to contribute to the question earlier about, like, what do we do when we have a conflict? And I see another question here about, like, when you have, like, how do you meet someone that you're not agreeing in the middle? There's now a question about engagement, right? A meeting is going the wrong way. And sometime in my experience, what I've done is try to meet others in our common goals. So, and I agree with what Jourdan was sharing earlier, 100%. And I think some of the dangers, the combination of groupthink and policing tone, right? And like, so people are not too emotional. Like the combination of that is just so, it impacts like decision making in a, in our organization, in our team in a negative way. But also the biggest hurdle, it's not listening, right? Not listening and kind of not empowering our colleagues. And that is something that is really dangerous to not listen to that. But like one thing we can do in a meeting if it's going the wrong way could be to kind of, if someone isn't being listened to, I can say, oh, I heard, Mary say a great point. Could we dive more into that? Or, and always have, I think saying words like, I am curious to learn what you think about these other ideas, right? Like having a tone that is open, and so that you are kind of brainstorming instead of narrowing down too quickly. Or if someone is being policed or like not being heard, is uplifting their voice and highlighting what they said and making sure that their name is in there. Sometimes we can also go to the people that we feel like there is this tension and they're losing out on being heard, to ask them, what does support looks like to you? We always want them to be the one to define how a supportive colleague can help them in a meeting or in any situation. So always listening to how you can help and giving power to those that can help with that. Sorry, Katie, I diverged back to the previous points.
Perfect, thank you. No, that was a beautiful answer. Thank you. Does anyone else want to talk a little bit about accessibility?
Katie, I'll just add that I do, kind of related to accessibility, I do think it's important to reflect on who is in the room and who isn't in the room, and how do you create opportunities for participation. A lot of people don't necessarily associate that with technical accessibility, but it also really is tied to that. So for example, like the Zoom chat is not an accessible feature of Zoom. And so when you're relying on the Zoom chat, you really need to make sure that you read out those questions, which it's wonderful that Ashley and Katie and are doing here in today's session, but to understand that some people don't really have access to using that. And so if you're only relying on that, needing to make space for people to have access is really important. And then also to just really think about how do you create accessibility practices in your in-person. So we see a lot of folks sharing their PowerPoints in advance, things like that, and really setting up people to succeed in their meetings because of accessibility challenges right now. And it would be wonderful to see that continue when we are back in person, and just really preparing people to succeed with regard to accessibility.
Thank you, Patrick. All right, we can move on to the next question, Ashley.
Sure. I'm going to kind of mix together our question that we had planned with one that came in through the Q&A. So this is for all panelists, so whoever wants to jump in first, feel free. But originally we were going to ask, have you ever felt that you weren't being listened to or respected while speaking in a meeting? If so, how did you respond? If you see this happening to someone else, how do you lift them up and amplify their voice? So the question that also came in similar to this one is, when there are aspects of communication which are clearly not acceptable, such as mansplaining, sexist microaggressions, if there's an imbalance of power, how do you address these? So I guess the question together would be a little bit more on what Mela was saying before about how to uplift your coworkers or colleagues when you see this happening. And also, if there's that imbalance of power, how do you address these types of things?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I'll try to answer a little bit of it. And it kind of comes down to culture. Some of our cultures, and these can be microcultures, whether it's in groups or teams or departments, some cultures are accepting of sort of in the moment feedback. And I would like to think that we can all get to a place at some point where we can receive feedback in real time. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And so I think being aware of that is really important. Some people might not be used to it. Some be used to this real-time feedback. And so if you're in a culture or a group or a team where maybe that real-time feedback might not be received well, maybe just pause after the meeting or that interaction, take a beat and think about an opportunity to reach out to that person and provide some feedback. They likely don't know that they made you feel the way they made you feel. And so taking them aside separately and in private might be a better way to reach out to them. It would be great if we can do this in person in real time. And I think that's the goal, right? To be able to kind of give that more kind of transparent real time support so that others are seeing it, and hopefully that will create other constructive support in the future, and ultimately create a culture where you can have more real-time feedback. This is not necessarily my area of expertise, and I feel like this is a very culture specific thing. So I've been in situations where I've wanted to say something to support a colleague or myself and did not, because I didn't think that information would be received. And I didn't want that person to feel slighted or uncomfortable in a larger group. And then, yeah, so I would say, I hope that's a helpful way of looking at it.
I completely agree with you as far as it being a culture specific thing, but I think too, to add to that, it's a person specific thing, because the person that may be doing it may, like you said, may not be aware, or may be well aware of who they are and how they show up to meetings or spaces, but there's no one to hold that person accountable. And I think that's something that's lacking in many spaces in general, is accountability. When you have, that power over people, or if there's a person within the team that is mansplaining or, taking the ideas of others and using them for themselves, that gets to be a tough work environment, or hostile or toxic work environment, whatever word you want to use. But that accountability factor, I think, is what's lacking when it comes to being able to mitigate these situations from coming up, or when they happen. Understanding who the person is and how they receive feedback or criticism is important to understand what your next move is going to be. it gets tough for sure, because you don't know how that person is going to receive that information and what manner or tone is necessary to provide them with that feedback or criticism. But I think too, it's important for us all to hopefully move to a space where we're all able to hold each other accountable for actions that are less than ideal when it comes to working in groups or teams. And hopefully we're able to get to that space. But I think once we get there, it'll be much easier to try to mitigate situations like this when they occur, because they probably happen daily, and it just goes unspoken of or unnoticed, or no one's being held accountable for how they're acting towards other, coworkers, and that makes things tough.
Thank you both. Katie, do you want to move on to the next question?
Sure. I actually want to pop in with a question from the Q&A that I think is sort of tangential to this, as well as relevant to what we spoke about earlier about groupthink. So someone in the Q&A said, I find that sometimes leadership has predefined ideas of what the outcomes they want to achieve in a meeting, and therefore set up meetings that aren't authentically seeking or encouraging input. It's hard to determine whether and when to speak up. Any advice? Do any of you have any thoughts on that?
I can provide something that we have done in our team with this. Something that you could do is, I think, start by sharing, your feeling, your kind of assumptions. It's like, this feels like there is a certain goal. Are you interested in input? Are you not just having kind of an open conversation and always using like open-ended questions to kind of see what the goal is with that leader? One thing that's really helpful is setting meeting norms, right? Like being able, sometimes it's really great to have a meeting about how we want to have meetings, right? If one person or a few people, it doesn't have to be the majority, think that this can be a lot better. So let's talk about our meetings and setting up some norms, right, of respect, of equity of voice, just having some of those things so that there's more inclusive thinking, less groupthink, and people feel like they're something that they will contribute will be heard and will impact the meeting. So I think trying to be vulnerable, I know that first step is being vulnerable and speaking up how you feel, how the meeting is going. It's a hard thing to do. Establishing the relationship is really important. It will make that a little easier, but it will never be easy to stop something and speak up. But setting up some norms and values will really help, so that when something goes sideways, you can go back to that norm that is agreed upon with all the members in that meeting. And this really helps in meetings that are reoccurring, right? Like having some norms so that you have a decision that works for everyone.
I would also add, great point, Mela. I would also add a very quick point on, sometimes when I hear no, which I hear a lot of, I hear no, not right now, right? I'm trying to train myself to hear no, not right now. And I think we all have to take accountability to champion our own ideas. I work in a lot of creative realms, and sometimes if someone just doesn't like what I'm doing or what I'm suggesting, first of all, it's not personal, right? It's just might not fit. And so I'll receive that feedback. Sometimes I'll agree, sometimes I won't agree in that moment, or sometimes I'll go back to the drawing board and think, all right, well, maybe they didn't hear me how I think they need to hear me. And I'll come back with a different perspective or more data, or a completely a reframe of that topic or answer. And so I would without being too annoying, I try not to be too annoying about it, but I definitely have trained myself to think just no, not right now is what I hear instead of no, and just champion your ideas. And I try to do that with colleagues too. So not just with my ideas, but when I see other colleagues pitch an idea and either it's, pushed aside or shot down, I try to maybe on the side say, hey, I think that's great. There's something there. Why don't you consider doing this, or consider going back to them with this reframe of it. So, you know, be an advocate too.
I'll share too, kind of, thank you, Amy, for that framing of the question. And I think going a little bit back to Jourdan's perspective on accountability and Mela's perspective on establishing values, I just wanted to share how the Poorvu Center kind of tackles these issues a little bit. So we as a center, very early on in the creation, I think in 2015, a couple months after the center was formed in 2014, together a working group to create a community values document and to understand how we would work together, and have that document be pretty fluid. And we're actually revisiting it this semester because our work environment has changed so much, and there's a new working group working on that document. I'm happy to share that in the chat at some point. But it really helps to hold everyone accountable to understand what the community values are. And then it provides our executive directors with a tool to use to talk about situations that arise that are difficult, because having difficult conversations is really hard. And so to provide yourself with kind of some guidelines and some tools is useful, and to rely on others to help you have those difficult conversations. So, you know, it's really hard, I think, going back to kind of fly and being young professionals, sometimes it's really hard to encounter these challenges for the first time in a workspace. And we might not necessarily know how to navigate it as well as our manager or their manager. And so to really rely on folks for that support is also something that you should consider, because they've likely encountered similar situations in the past and can really help you navigate that situation.
Great, thank you.
I wanted to add one thing, Katie, if that's
Sure.
okay.
Yeah,
yeah, so one actually great resource, I'm at the School of Medicine, but one great resource that we have on professionalism in the workplace is the Office of Academic and Professional Development. So that is a great resource for someone to go to and just kind of talk through like any conflict that is affecting the workplace. So again, that's Office of Academic and Professional Development. And another resource, I actually just took this professional development training recently at Yale. It's Mastering Difficult Conversations. And it's like three Zoom sessions, and you get to like practice that with, it's offered by the Office of Effectiveness and Staff Development from HR. And then I have one last thing. Yeah, I think on an individual level, trying to do the work and practicing difficult conversation is important. But something that has been helpful to me is also the power of community. I think future leaders of Yale, for many of us, it's a community that has helped me feel empowered, find my voice, right? Practice that, but you can also create mini communities in the mini cultures that are around Yale in your organization, and being able to have a safe space in those communities before you bring up a difficult topic is really helpful, as other colleagues can support and be there for you. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Patrick.
thank you guys all, and thank you for that great resource, Mela. Ashley, I will defer to you whether you want to do the final scripted question or if you want to just jump into Q&A, because we have a lot of great questions coming in.
Yeah, let's jump into the Q&A. So let's do one question that came in is, and this is for anyone to jump in and answer. People always say to tell a story while answering a question. Could you please tell us how we should go about that?
So my first kind of thoughts around that question really go to what might be the goal of sharing the story. And I think a lot of times for me, when I'm trying to share a story, I'm also just trying to humanize the context of the situation and put my own vulnerability on display. And so maybe it's not necessarily a story, but just to find ways to really kind of shift the context and make it a little bit more understandable and relatable for folks in the room. But
to humanize it a little
eager to
bit.
hear
Yeah.
what others.
I mean, that's also what I think when I hear storytelling. It allows for the listener, at the very least, to be able to input themselves into the story and kind of relate their own experiences with it. It makes it to the point that was just made more human and personable and even relatable at that rate. But I think too, it's important to recognize and understand the audience. So storytelling may not be the best mode of communication for everyone. There may be people who just need kind of bullet points or high level points to be able to move forward or understand what's trying to be communicated. But storytelling, it is definitely effective in many ways. And I think the biggest factor behind that is being able to relate to it and implant your own self into the experiences or draw from your experiences. And of course, the human aspect of it. But I think it's more important to recognize the audience and understand what the most effective mode of communication for that particular audience would be in that situation.
Definitely. If there is no more input on that one, Katie, do you want to go ahead and read the next one?
Sure. We had someone ask, what if you were dealing with a hostile audience and you were accurate in your feelings? How do you continue communicating your point without feeling belittled? And anyone can start with that.
I think that's when I would kind of address that with the resources that Yale provides. We probably can agree on that feeling belittled is not okay in the workplace. We know it does happen, but I think addressing that to the resources so that there can be some system that can create that accountability would be great. Speaking to a trusting colleague, maybe starting with that, like speaking with a colleague that you trust in the community would be helpful, just to kind of run it by them and talk it through. Those are some of the things that would start. I don't know if there's other suggestions.
I guess when I hear that question, the first reaction that I have is living your truth, and no one can use it against you. Because when it comes to feelings and being accurate, they're always going to be accurate. They may not be agreed upon by the audience, but your feelings are absolutely accurate because you are the assessor of the accuracy in that regard. It's tough, I do believe, when it comes to people not agreeing with your feelings, or in a sense belittling your emotion or reaction to certain things. But I guess I take a step back and look internally or self-assess in that regard. And, stand in the confidence of what I'm trying to communicate, stand in the confidence of my reaction and my feeling, and continue on. Everyone's not going to agree, and I think that's okay. That's definitely an aspect of life for sure. But I don't think that, your emotion or your message should be shifted just based on people not agreeing with you. I find it a little bit difficult to stay in a space of feeling belittled, especially if I feel strongly about what I'm trying to communicate. I'm going to get these words off regardless. It's just a matter of, being confident in what I'm saying and knowing myself and knowing that my feelings are definitely valid. And, this may not be the audience for what I'm trying to communicate, and that's okay too. But there'll end up being a ton of self-assessing throughout that process. And you have a decision to continue on or recognize that this just may not be what's right for these people at this time. But I guess there's a lot of internal battles that would end up going on with that. And I don't think there's going to be a right way to approach it. It's just a matter of how you then respond that makes sense for you.
That's such a great point that you made, because you know, I think this can go back to a lot of things, whether it's different political beliefs or just anything that can strike up an argument between people. If you stand by what you're saying and you're confident in it, there's no need to go back and forth with these people. There's no need to let them belittle you or feel belittled by them, because it's not worth your time. And it's really hard in the moment, though, to tell yourself that and to listen to it and follow it. But that's a really great point about just being confident in what you believe in, because that can push you pretty far.
Yeah, I don't know that I can improve upon that. It was a great answer, Jourdan. I would just say, you know, first of all, I'm sorry that you feel that you're being belittled. You're in a culture where that's accepted, so that's not acceptable. You shouldn't be belittled. If I know I'm going into a situation where that might happen, or it might be a little bit, there might be, you know, I might be at odds with somebody. I often like to have speaking points and just make sure I stick to those either speaking points and really just take the emotion out of it. You know, don't stoop to whatever level that is. And so that tends to help center me in those situations where I just kind of go back to my inner still core. I remind myself that this is a professional setting. If they choose to act in a way that is not fitting this environment, that doesn't mean I need to stoop to that level. And again, I'm sorry that you have to deal with that. That's not acceptable.
I think the only thing I'll add, Amy, to that too, and to go a little bit back to what Jourdan and Mela were saying, was really to just rely a lot on the resources too that Yale has provided, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion has been a wonderful resource, at least for me in my experience at Yale, for making me feel empowered as a person. There are wonderful sets of co-chairs who are always willing to have, you know, an open ear to listen to what's happening in your environment. And there are a lot of other resources that, you know, it's helpful to kind of document when something has become kind of just no longer acceptable in the workplace, just so that that's out there, and so that you potentially are helping not only yourself but other people in your department and in that environment. So I would also say, you know, maybe contact your HRG and really seek out kind of the institutional resources that might be able to help you as well, as Mela said.
Thank you, guys. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Let me pull one more from the Q&A. This one's actually very, very interesting. This person says, in my experience, there are some people who like to ask and hear open-ended questions while others hate it and end up punting the question. Any tips on best strategies for being cognizant in the moment of neurodiversity and cross-cultural communication diversity in the room? It's a really good question.
I think a situation like this is always going to come down to the leadership and the people who make up the space of, you know, the meeting or the environment. You know, something like this is extremely intentional when you're basically downplaying someone's thoughts, or really not respecting the ideas or input from others. And I think that comes down to leadership, quite frankly. If things like that are happening and there is no one in the room to be able to speak up, I think a person would have to, I kind of caution what I end up saying with this question. I think it's always going to be important to make sure that no matter what, you have an outlet. If there are things happening within a team or a space or a department, that you have somewhat of an outlet to be able to share your frustrations or thoughts with. It may not be the right place for you to say that or voice those opinions on your team or in your department. There may not be a level of comfort there, but hopefully you do have somewhat of an outlet to be able to express yourself and then try to get some guidance around how to move forward. Everyone doesn't have the confidence to speak up. Everyone doesn't have, to my earlier point, the social capital to speak up and actually influence what's happening in a space. And when those situations occur, when your ideas are being punted, or if there are questions that are being asked that are just kind of being dismissed or minimized, you need somewhere to let that out. And unfortunately, we're in a space where, in general, accountability is not at an all-time high. So in order for you to, I think, protect yourself and your mental space is definitely to be able to have somewhat of an outlet in a person or a thing or an activity. Because unfortunately, everything is not going to be able to be, fixed or resolved within a team, especially when it comes to, ideas being shot down. But to protect yourself outside of that, I think is always important, like I said, to have somewhat of an outlet, because all team issues aren't going to be able to be solved. There are people who don't even recognize that some teams have issues, or not willing to accept the fact that there are issues, or they just may not have the proper lens to be able to see certain things. And that's going to be the case in many aspects. But I think it's more important for you, the individual, to be able to protect yourself, and not allow for that to be your downfall ultimately.
I would add, if you're aware that you are in a neurodiverse or culturally diverse group and that this could be a challenge, you might want to consider framing your question a couple different ways in the moment. And I've seen this work really well in our remote environment, utilize Zoom poll or chat, or invite the chat function, invite people to participate in a chat function, or perhaps people aren't comfortable in a group setting responding to an open-ended question. So perhaps there's a place, whether it's a Google Sheet document, Google Doc, or we use Confluence at Yale SOM quite a bit. Maybe it's a shared document in a place where you can pose the question or a project and invite comments on it, so that those who might want to take a little bit more time and thought, maybe it's a language issue or something, they can take some time and thought and actually respond to it, so they're not being put in on the moment. So just consider kind of a variety of channels and timing.
Those are great points, Jourdan, and to Jordan's point about kind of understanding the lens in which people are coming at different things is really important. In my mind, I think, to kind of get at your being cognizant in the moment part of the question, I think it's really important to self-assess and to self-reflect. I think one of the best ways to do that is to try to understand your unconscious bias that you're bringing into every space. There are great resources out there. Harvard has a website that kind of allows you to assess your unconscious bias, which is really important. And just raising your own awareness allows you to recognize those moments where these situations are happening. And I think that will go a little bit of ways to kind of creating a community where you're recognizing who's sharing and how often. And I, for one, am like very aware that I feel like I've shared too much in this meeting so far, and trying to limit how much I'm speaking.
Yeah, I agree, Patrick. I think Harvard, I think it's the project implicit. The implicit bias test is really useful. And this conversation and the questions, it making me think, and I wonder if bias training and cross-cultural training is something that we need more and more at Yale. And I thank you, Jourdan, for sharing like what someone can do at that individual level, to survive in a healthy way. And I want to say that all of us own the cultures that we're in. right? It's all of us, definitely from the leadership, but all of us own the culture and being supportive of our colleagues, and creating a culture where everyone is respected. It's everyone's job to be a champion of that. So maybe we can advocate for more training, and for more ways where we can practice having those difficult conversations, so that, and we know not everything will be, solvable, and there's nothing has a quick solution when it comes to what we're talking about, but moving in the right direction is the right thing to do. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. You guys have been such amazing panelists, and everyone who's asked questions, those have been amazing questions. We're really grateful that you guys have all been here today, both as panelists and audience members. There is one final question that I think is directed to Patrick about seeing the community values document that you mentioned. So if you could share that in some capacity, that'd be really helpful. Any final thoughts before we wrap up for the day?
Katie, I'll just add that I hope that it appeared. I tried to place it in the chat for panelists and attendees, our 2016 Poorvu Center Community Values document with the link on our website. And another great resource that I have, I think the question also asked a little bit about meeting norms, and Mela talked about kind of establishing those meeting norms. So there's a link in there to a Harvard Business Review article that has some helpful suggestions for kind of grounding your meetings. So that might be something that folks want to take a look at.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing all those links. I know that this conversation has made me very grateful to work at Yale, where these kind of conversations can happen and people are thinking about these things and how to be more respectful and inclusive, and responsible and creative and compassionate. It's just really, really wonderful to hear your insights today. And I know you've given me a lot of things to think about in my own working world. So I just want to say thank you guys. Ashley, I welcome you to also give your thanks. I'm just so happy that we had this today, and I really appreciate everybody's insights.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you all so much. And thank you to all the attendees and all of the questions that were sent in as well.
Well, thank you again, guys. Thanks everybody for joining us today. There will be a recording. We'll post it to the Fly website, and be on the lookout for more great Fly programming. I know we have a lot more good stuff coming up. So thank you guys again, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.